maybe. Yep. Okay, we're live. Actually, Fred, let me just come back to just me for a second, and just a quick thing before we get into the talk of this week. I just want to say that if you have any questions for our guest, please write them in the Twitch chat or tweet at us hashtag Subvisual Talks, and we'll try to look them over and ask them. Okay. So before or now we can go back to both of us. Fred, welcome and thanks for joining us here.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for having me.
Um, so for those that don't know you, do you want to give a quick intro? We'll be talking more about what you've done so far and a lot of other things, but just a quick intro.
Yeah, so my name is Fred, specifically and more in Portuguese, Fred Oliveira, or Frederico, as my mother calls me, but she's probably the only one. But I am an engineer by heart, and been working in this industry for a long time. Yeah, I don't know. What do you want to know?
Cool. Yeah, so you said one thing that is true. You're the first Portuguese guest that we have here at Subvisual Live Talks, which for me is fun, being in Portugal as well. Um, so I'll start now for real with the first question I ask everyone, which is how did you get involved in tech? Like, what was your first experience with tech? Was it very early on, or were you a late bloomer?
I was an early lucker, which means I was very fortunate to have parents who gave me one very specific gift very early in my life that kind of made it all go from there. I think I was 6. I got a Spectrum,
Hmm.
which is one of those very old computers that you have to run a program, you'd have to use a tape, a cassette tape. And so it only ran BASIC. And so at 6, I got that. And I obviously had no idea what computers were, obviously. But it was an opportunity to experiment. And because I didn't have a lot of games, I had to experiment with what I had, and the Spectrum made it really easy to look at the source code for some of the games, and there were some apps, programs for it, and so I just explored a little bit of the source code, and then the second piece of it that made me extra lucky was one of my uncles had access to a BASIC manual, and he gave it to me, and it was like this thick, and I had obviously it was also in English, and I'm Portuguese born and raised. I had no idea about English at the time, but I could copy and paste from paper to the computer, and I started some very basic, literally, experiments, and so things just came from there. I started coding, I don't know, maybe a year, 2 years later, so before I was 10, which was very fortunate. I didn't know that I wanted to do that as, for a living, obviously. We can talk about that a little bit more because at a point, I didn't even know that this was going to be it. But yeah, I started very early by just
Yeah,
being very fortunate.
so you're saying like very early on you started with BASIC, but so you started programming before you were 10, you're saying, but did you continue programming all the way till now? Was there
I
ever a
did.
gap where you always? And so what languages were you doing at the time? What kind of projects were you interested at, like growing up as a kid? In Portugal, I'm
Yeah.
sure you didn't, at least going to my childhood, I'm sure you didn't have a lot of people doing the same things you were doing in coding. That was at least not very
Yeah.
common when I was growing
Certainly
up.
not at my age, right?
Yeah,
Certainly not at my
yeah, yeah.
age. But so I started with basic, right? Before the age of 10, just really basic experiments. Like I keep
Hmm.
saying basic, but it's just an unfortunate coincidence. But I started with basic, and then eventually I started to learn Pascal.
Hmm.
And and during school, middle school, and high school, I started actually attending classes that were for high school, so 10th grade to 12th grade, and they were teaching Pascal at the time, and so I learned from those guys. Maybe a few years before I took those classes also. So basic to Pascal to then C. And when I was doing C, I was also exploring assembly and just, lower level languages, I guess.
Hmm. Where,
And
how
then,
are you learning? So you're saying Pascal, basically you learn from a book. Pascal, you learn from
yep,
in high school and with other
yep.
people. I'm assuming C as well, because that was a language that in high school people taught very often here, at least here in Portugal. But what about like the other stuff where you learn anything like assembly? Where it was all just from textbooks, or
Just self,
did you start
just
looking
self-taught.
online for? Were there any resources online at the time, or anything that you would use?
Yeah, so I'm trying to do the math as to when this was. And this must have been, I don't know, maybe 96, 97,
Hmm.
right? The Pascal C assembly years. At the time, you could get some books from libraries, and that was probably the best resource that you had. Um, Online just really wasn't much of a thing. I remember going online was literally going to NBA.com and downloading GIFs, which is, it's what it was. I thought that I could download the entire internet, which is not true. You cannot do that, I think. But yeah, mostly books. Mostly books were the resource then.
Okay. And then after like that high school years where you're learning and before that, did you decide to go to college for computer science, or did you go for something else?
No, I eventually decided that computer science was it. For a long time, I didn't know that was going to be the case. I thought maybe I'm going to be a lawyer, maybe I'm going to be something else. At a point, a teacher tried to convince me to go into architecture.
Hmm.
I don't know why, but I ended up just following programming because it was just something that I was really into, obviously.
Hmm.
And so in university, I just learned, what you might imagine. I learned Java, which is, not my favorite, but still a learning experience. C++, obviously. And after a while, and this starts to get into 2004 and 5, then I discovered Ruby, right?
Hmm.
Which is what I've been doing ever since, pretty much,
Cool.
as a main language.
So those years that's mostly what you're doing during college. Were you already doing anything professionally as a hobby, like actually coding, and not just like whatever was part of the courses?
Yeah. So during university, I started. So this goes into how I became a part of TechCrunch and then the California Times. But I started blogging about technology a lot,
Hmm.
and writing about it because I was very passionate about specific areas of it. Um, and as I was learning, all these things happen at the same time, but I was also learning Ruby, or starting to get the hang of Ruby. And I started to create a product for project management. Um, Interestingly, as competition to Basecamp, which was where I drew my inspiration. And so I thought maybe I can do this a little bit better, and which is obviously not true. Those guys are great, but that's how I started.
Were you doing that
With
by yourself, or?
initially by myself, but then I got colleagues to help and get involved, and that's how we started our consultancy. Eventually, a couple of years later, everything stemmed from learning Ruby in parallel to the university, doing all sorts of side projects and just coding for people as a contractor, I guess.
Hmm.
And then I decided to make something out of it and start a company. This is
Cool.
2007.
And do you recommend that for other people in college, that they do these side projects? Do you think that you actually learn more from those than actual college, or not really?
Um, so, so the old me would probably just immediately say, yes, absolutely. College is worthless and just do your own thing. I like to think that I've grown a little bit, but I still, in my heart, I still believe that whatever you do in your own free time is what drives you, right? And so what you find as a person, what you find yourself doing whenever you have no person commanding you, if you're doing something, that probably means that you're passionate about it.
Mm-hmm.
And that probably also means that you'll be better at it also, right? And so that's a long way to get to, I don't know, if programming really is your thing and you're doing it at all times, regardless of whether, it's homework from university or some sort of job that you have, if you're still doing programming, then you're already on your path to just, living that particular dream. I don't know if I'm going to be prescriptive as to say, absolutely do everything outside of university. There's definitely things that university has taught me that I wouldn't have learned by myself. When you learn for yourself, you're very practical, right? Because you want to do something. And so you go down this very straight line. So I don't know. I think for each person, it will be a hybrid. I think the key learning from university for me was learning how to learn, right? Really understanding what it takes for getting this challenge and then learning everything that you have to. Because what I learned in university is no longer relevant, right? Even yesterday, I was thinking, I learned about semantic web because someone was discussing that on Hacker News. It's, it's still a thing, but it's completely irrelevant. But the idea of all the things that we explored then around semantic web, many of those are relevant. So I don't know. It's a bit of a hybrid.
No, I get it. I was just here wondering, you said you got into Ruby at that time, Ruby on Rails. And I was
Ruby
wondering,
and
like,
Ruby on Rails,
yeah,
yeah.
yeah. I was just wondering, like, what drove you to it? How do you heard about it? Because that was pretty early on. Like, I got involved into Ruby a few years later, and
Yeah.
that community here in Portugal is actually how we met. But we'll get there. And even when I got involved into Ruby, it was still very niche, and there wasn't a lot of things going on. So when you got involved, it was even before that. So how do you heard
Yeah.
about Ruby?
So honestly, I can't remember exactly how I learned about Ruby and Ruby on Rails specifically. I know that I was already following, David Meyer Hansen and Jason Fried because they were basically starting Basecamp at that time, right? Just maybe a year earlier, and they started Basecamp. And when they extracted Ruby on Rails from Basecamp, the app, right, and Ruby on Rails, I can't remember what the version was that they first published, right? But it was not 1.0 for Ruby on Rails. That's when I started to look at it, and the things that I found interesting about Ruby that really caught my eye were the expressiveness. So it's very close to a language, a human language, right? You can be very expressive. In its design, the language feels like that. And it was just so productive as well, right? Ruby on Rails specifically. It was very, very productive for me. I felt very, like things were very easy, to just put something on the web that already has a database, that already does a number of things that we now take for granted.
Yeah.
That was the first time that a full framework did that for me, right?
Mm-hmm.
So that was it.
Do you still feel the same way that it's still as productive now compared to a different landscape than it was 15 years ago?
So Ruby on Rails has grown a lot, right? The Ruby ecosystem. So let's take them separately because the Ruby ecosystem has
It's way
grown
older.
it's definitely way older, but it really exploded with Ruby on Rails also in popularity and just size. And the Ruby ecosystem is very robust. It's great. Ruby on Rails specifically, I love the framework. I think it's great. But it shows signs of just being large now, right? It doesn't feel as snappy. I remember the first the first tutorial for Ruby on Rails was the classic, I think it was the blog application that David created, right? So it was just create a new blog and create your first model and connect it to the database and all that, right? These days, to do the same thing, you have to explain a lot more nuance because the framework itself has evolved and grown. But I still feel like it's a super productive, super good framework for people who want to just create an app right on the web. I still think it's great.
Okay, we'll circle back to that, but moving back a little bit to where we were.
Yeah.
So that time, I believe, was the same time you said you're blogging and you started writing for TechCrunch at that time.
Yes.
How
Yeah.
did that happen?
I mean, we're going to be talking about luck again, right? Because I was very fortunate a number of times in my life. That's another one. So I started blogging about technology and companies, startups specifically, and the challenges that they were trying to solve around 2004, 5, 6. And sometime in 2005, the same summer, right? Summer 2005, I believe, two very cool things happened in my life. That I was in the right place and with the right mindset and with the right audience also to get. The first one was Google launched their Summer of Code initiative, which was in 2005. Google was a 6-year-old company, right? And so they were starting to mature. They had a lot of people. They decided to go give back to open source. And they decided to support open source projects with money, or they decided to support people with money to contribute to open source. And I was already contributing to GNOME, the desktop environment at the time. And I decided to apply to Google Summer of Code, and they would only take 40 people. It was the first year. Now they take thousands, but I applied, and at the same time I was writing about all this technology. And as follow up to one of my posts, I have this guy email me, right? And so the two stories happened at a very specific time. I believe it was June or July of 2005. Where in the same week I get an email from Google saying I've been accepted, and an email from Michael Arrington, the founder of TechCrunch, saying, "Hey, why don't you move to California to work with me on TechCrunch and a startup that he was working on." And so, very lucky coincidence that I had the attention of just this very big company, or starting to be very, very big in Google, and them supporting me with money to work on open source. And at the same time, Mike wanting me to write for TechCrunch. So it was really just being in the right time / place.
So you went to California at the time?
I did, yeah.
Was it
I decided
where in San Francisco or somewhere else?
So in California, there's above Palo Alto and under San Francisco, there's a number of cities, like Redwood City, Atherton, and I lived in Atherton, California, just above Mountain View, Palo Alto, all of that. That was the TechCrunch headquarters were there, and so that's where I lived.
How was the experience of first of all moving to a different country, and then also like being in such a vibrant environment, I'm sure, for someone getting into tech?
So the answer to the first part, scary. Mm-hmm. The answer to the second part, super exciting, and again, very lucky, right? Very fortunate, because everything was happening in that part of the world at that specific time. Facebook was getting started, Twitter was getting started, all these YouTube, which there's a funny story there as well, which we may get to. But all those things were happening in California at the same time. So I was very fortunate to be flying over there, even though I was scared shitless, right? Mm-hmm. And so was my family for me. But it was obviously a really good opportunity. Everybody, and also TechCrunch after I joined exploded, right? When I joined, we had about 100 feeders a day or subscribers to the RSS feed. When I left, it was millions, right? And so it was a big
exposure for you.
Well, certainly, yes, certainly. I was talking to all these entrepreneurs, right? To write about them, I was, meeting the folks from the Googles and the YouTubes and Twitter. All those things were happening at the same time. Yeah, so that was awesome.
Was that a time where you decided you wanted to found your own company, or did
it was right before?
Yeah,
it was right before, because out of TechCrunch came a lot of opportunity, right? I was meeting a lot of people, and they knew that I was a programmer and an engineer, and so there was, and still is, obviously, a lot of demand for engineers, and so there was a lot of opportunity there as well. And so after a while, I thought, maybe I can make something out of this, right? Maybe I can make a business out of building products, because that's when my passion for just building things for people started to grow and grow. And so I thought maybe I can make a business out of that. And We Break Stuff, the name of my company, that's We Break Stuff for people who don't know. That's the genesis of the whole thing, was out of the opportunities that were coming from Silicon Valley for me. Yeah.
Why, if I may ask, why a consultancy company that was what We Break Stuff was, as far as I'm aware, and not create your own product? Was it you just didn't have anything that you were that passionate about, or like what was the reason?
We did both. It was just so the thing about consultancies, and you know this, is that to run a successful consultancy, you want to work with other people, but maybe you have some ideas of your own, but you can't just build your own ideas, because otherwise you won't have money to sustain yourself, right? So that was the core philosophy behind WBS. Was maybe we'll just be a hybrid of build our own products, and to make money to sustain those products, we'll just work for other people and build products for them. That's what we did.
That's a familiar thing. I think that's most small consultancies. I'm not talking about the Accentures of this world, but small consultancies, I think they all start like that, at least.
Yep.
So that's funny. Okay, so then how long were you in California for?
A few months. Because altogether a few months. There was the visa situation. After a while, I really had to decide: do I want to stay and apply for a work visa and then eventually a green card, or do I just want to, get out? So you asked, what does it feel like to move to a different country? And the longer answer to that, in addition to just scary, is I had family and friends and a relationship here in Portugal at the time. And so all of those, they weigh heavy on you when you're going through that. And so after a while, it was pretty obvious that I liked what I did, that meeting the people that I was meeting was a huge privilege, obviously, and a big opportunity. But I was starting to grow my own thesis, which is I still have the same value if I'm somewhere else, right? So maybe I can take some of these opportunities from here to Portugal. And that's eventually what I did. And I started We Break Stuff with just folks from university that I knew that were really talented here in Portugal.
So you're saying you brought a lot of stuff from that time. Do you still apply some of those, some of that knowledge? Particularly, I'm thinking, I'm sure maybe not tech-wise specifically in terms of programming, but in terms of building products. Is there still something that you've learned? You mentioned some stories with YouTube. I don't know if there's anything there for this, but any of those companies that were starting that you saw like, oh, this is how they were starting, and now look where they are. Is there any parallel that you can do there?
Yeah, so ask me about the YouTube story later, because it's not related, and I want to stick to this question. But the YouTube story is funny. That's why I'm saying you can ask it later. It's also embarrassing. But in terms of product knowledge, that I brought from that time, A few things. So a few things that I learned specifically in California that are very different from how other places in the world do product. In California, because everything was booming at that time, right? This was when Y Combinator was just exploding. This was when, as I said, YouTube, Google, all those things were just becoming, some of them becoming things and some of them exploding, right? Like truly becoming huge, like Google. Facebook was only just becoming a thing, for example. So did YouTube. But this sense of just moving fast and just going through your ideas and how you validate those ideas, et cetera. A lot of that I learned, obviously with time, but a lot of that was condensed in that time in California, just by talking to a lot of people, right? Because I was very fortunate to talk to a lot of folks because of TechCrunch. So it was a confluence of just very fortunate events.
Interesting that you say that, because most of those companies started with venture capital money, so that
Yep.
makes them go faster. What's your take on that approach versus a more, let's say, Basecamp way of doing things? They're not just Basecamp, a lot of
Yeah.
other companies, but they push it a lot when you're bootstrapping, or even if you take money, but you're doing things at a more sustainable pace.
Yeah. So I've definitely seen both approaches. In my own personal projects, I always went with the bootstrap. Ask any investor; they will always tell you only raise capital if you need it and as late as possible, right? So that's even an investor who has an interest in giving you money so that he or she gets ownership will tell you the same thing. But me personally, I also believe that there's this dynamic that gets into you when you get capital. And I saw a lot of companies just perish because they got, a series of capital and just didn't know what to do with it, or they spent it wrong, or they thought, hey, now that we have all this money, maybe all we need to do is grow. And that puts the incentive way too deep into the wrong side of the scale, in my opinion. Because in theory, what you should actually be doing is just, making sure that you get to the right product, hire enough people to get to where you want to be, and then just grow, right? Learn and grow. And there's a feedback loop that you can get to. If you put money into that wheel very, very soon, sometimes you'll just go completely off course. When you don't put any money in, you are forced into building something that people want. Otherwise, you won't make any money. Otherwise, you'll just fail, right? And so I'm of the philosophy that if you can not raise any capital, don't. Obviously, some projects and some products and some ideas require money, right? Because sometimes you really need to explode if you're working on an area of the market that is about to blow up, right? If let's say, for example, that you're working with, I don't know, maybe machine learning today, or maybe cryptocurrency a couple of years ago, right? It was exploding so quickly that money made it easier for you to get to where you need to be. But you have to do that in a way that is sustainable, and people need to understand that nuance, right? Or the pressure that money puts on you and your company. And so I'm of the philosophy that you should bootstrap. Yeah. But if you need to raise money, then do it. Just be responsible.
Having helped a lot of companies in the crypto space, I can tell you that overinvestment is definitely something that exists.
Especially in their area, yeah.
Yeah. But so continuing with your career, you then moved to I'm going to skip some steps, but you then eventually came to different companies, and now you're working at Union, right? And where in a lot of these companies, you're still helping startups and helping people get started with their projects and building them into companies. That's correct?
Yeah. Yes.
So go ahead.
No, I was just going to say that's always been my key thing. And whenever I reflect on, where I am with my life, I always come back to just one key sentence, which is what I really like to do is build things that real people use, right? And so I've always, even when I was working on companies like Disruption, which was before this. And Disruption was very into the financial markets and investors and venture capital specifically. It was not the target audience, the people on the street. Even when I was working in that area, I still felt like I wanted to do something for the people out there, right? People like me. And so I've always tried to do products either on the side or just help people who are doing that. And so I really need to feel grounded. I feel like I need to be working on or helping people just put products out there that are for real humans and not venture capitalists, because those are not human. That's obviously a joke, by the way.
Yeah.
Venture capital friends, that's a joke.
But yeah, so what I was getting into is that in any product team, you have two sides. You have you have supply and you have the demand. And what I mean by this is, so you have demand in the sense of you're consuming ideas, you're consuming just general like research from customers, and you're expected to supply a product, right? So you have this is a two-sided marketplace. Let's say let's put it like that. So I was wondering, is there any framework that you've seen over the years that works better in your opinion for this demand part? So for getting the requirements, for understanding customers, or just for validating an idea, how do you get from that into product market fit or something like that?
And so when you say framework, you really mean just a framework,
mental
a way to
framework,
think, a mental framework. Yeah. Right. Because we're both
not a technical framework, just a way of thinking, a way of doing things.
Yeah. I identify with two key things are always in my mind when I'm either building products or looking at companies who do. One is just obviously agile in general, right? The idea of quick iteration, not focusing on the big deliverable, the utopia 1.0, just building the whole thing at once. That's number one, right? So the idea of agile, and we could go into why agile is good or bad, and there are things that are good and things that are bad about it. But in general, the idea of just taking things one thing at a time, quick iteration, makes sense. So that's part one of my mental framework. Part two would be lean startup, but not the book or not the person that invented it. Just the idea of the feedback loop where you build something, first you design it and validate it, but then build it and then learn from the data that you get out of that specific thing, and then you move on to the next thing and you keep that loop going, right? And so I'm not really big on, so I just threw two big buzzwords out there, agile and lean startup, but the ideas behind them are what I really care about. It's not necessarily about,
how do you validate, in your opinion, how do you validate that, and how do you get data? Because when you're saying data, I'm assuming, especially as a startup, you won't have a lot of quantitative data because you won't have a lot of customers. You can try to get it somehow, but you're mostly working with qualitative data, right? So how do you work in such a scenario where you're just starting, you don't have a base, you don't have anything? How is that? Because that's if you're working with startups, and I've worked with startups most of my professional career as well, that's where you are most of the time. Yeah. How do you get going from there?
Yeah. So you have to talk to people, right? If you don't talk to your audience, you're not doing something right. You're not doing everything that you can, right? And so you might be limited in terms of the amount of data that you get, but I definitely feel like validating with, even if it's just a few user interviews or a few data points that you collect automatically based on usage, right? I think that sometimes a nugget of information is enough, right? To validate a little bit. And then, it's ideally you get to a feedback loop where that even the amount of data that you get grows. But that's, just the small validation with targeted people or looking at quantitative data that you collect. All those things are sort of add up to validation.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I'm asking because this is an aspect of product that I'm really interested in, and I work in a lot, and that's like I just want to understand a little bit better, like how you do these kind of things. Because
Yeah.
as you're saying, money can like speed things up, but if you're not learning, you're just like burying yourself quicker. That's all you're doing. Um, okay, so moving a little bit here, I would like now to ask you about that YouTube story you're saying. Let's get
Okay.
into that.
Okay. Let's talk about that one. That one's embarrassing, but also funny. So imagine me, young guy that doesn't, I was very lucky to be in the place that I am, and the place in this story is California. I'm sitting in the couch. So as an aside, the TechCrunch headquarters back then was a house, right? That's where me and Mike lived, right? And also Gabe Rivera, the founder of TechMeme, which I don't know if you know, but is one of my favorite websites, techmeme.com. So we were living there, and we call it the headquarters because that's where TechCrunch was born. But it was a house.
It's more professional that way.
Exactly. And so I'm literally sitting at this couch in our living room working on something. I don't know what. Someone shows up at the door. And, just classic. I opened the door, and it was this guy. I'll talk about the name later. But it was this guy who wanted to talk to me. And I was like, sure, yeah, fine. Just meet me, just come with me to the couch. And he was telling me about the startup that he was, spoiler alert, obviously I gave it away. It was YouTube. But it was a tiny thing at the time, right? Very small. I'm working on this startup about video on the web, and I'd like you to get involved, right? And I didn't know about YouTube then. Obviously, YouTube was again very, very, very small, just starting. And I said, I don't know. I don't really believe video on the internet's going to be a big thing very quickly. And so I said no, right? I said no to being one of the first maybe 10 people working for what eventually became YouTube and was sold to Google. I don't even know when in relation to that, but for a lot of money. And so, just sometimes you say no to random things that seem just bad or inappropriate or just not the right timing for you. And it turns out, maybe I could be.
No one knows the future, right? You can know. It's just that happens.
Yeah, it's just if you think about it, back then it was just a random guy going, that you invite in, and it turns out that it's Chad Hurley, the founder of YouTube, who wants to hire you for a position at YouTube. So yeah.
Anyway, so another question that I had for you that I think a lot of people ask you is about your Twitter handle, because it's definitely interesting. And as we were talking a little bit beforehand, also sometimes a problem for you. So I'm interested in the story of how you got it.
How I got it is very easy, right? How I got it, I was just on Twitter very, very early. Twitter started in 2006. I think early 2006, if I'm not getting my dates mixed up. And I joined in September or maybe October. And so I was just there very early, one of the first accounts. And so I just got the dumbest username, which was just a single letter. And it felt, because Twitter was so small, it was just fine back then to have that name. These days, it's a little bit more complicated because I get a lot of notifications that are not for me, and Twitter in general. If we go into engineering talk, their regular expression to parse usernames is very bad, and so whenever you type @f and some sort of symbol, whatever symbol that might be, I get it, right? And so a lot of people just curse there's a really interesting word. It starts with F. I don't know if this is kid friendly, so I'll keep it kid friendly. But you can imagine that when people curse at the world when they say F something, I get it, and so it's kind of weird. But that, how I got it is just I was just there very early.
Yeah.
So I was very lucky.
Cool. So moving on again now to today. So as we were talking about previously, you're now at Union, which works with startups. Is it can you consider it as a consultancy or?
No, we build a product, right? So we
Okay.
build a product for startup communities and startup programs and investment funds. So it can be explained very quickly, even though our webpage doesn't necessarily do not a great job, but it doesn't explain it as efficiently. But basically, let's say that you are running an accelerator program, right? And you have a number of startups, a number of entrepreneurs. Maybe you have a number of mentors that have office hours. You run a bunch of events. Union is basically the glue that connects all these things, right? So it's a platform where you can organize events, have conversations between people, host office hours, all those things that go into running a startup program. We basically do in Union. So that's basically what the platform is.
And you're saying you're still doing Rails today, so may I assume that Union is built in Rails?
Union is built in Rails, yeah. It's a very large application.
Is it one monolith application? Is how you build it?
Yeah, right now it's a monolith. We've toyed back and forth with the idea of splitting it up, but we really haven't. For many reasons. One, we're not a very big team, right? It's just 4 engineers. And so just managing the breaking up a monolith into multiple services is complicated for a team of that size. But also it felt there's this debate happening right now about monolith versus microservice oriented architectures. And I don't necessarily know where I stand on that debate. I've been on both sides, I think. And I think for the right application, the right framework is better. Framework as in the architecture. But yeah, Union right now is a monolith, and that's been working out just fine.
So what has the experience been like in terms of building and maintaining that Rails application? It's all fine, I'm assuming all going well, but any particular tidbit of knowledge that you got from working on this particular code base versus other Rails apps that you've worked on?
So the problem, quote unquote, with Union is that it does, so Union as a platform, it does many things, right? And so it's a large monolith. Because you can have a monolith that is very small, right? Let's say a to-do application, that's a monolith maybe, but it's very small, so very contained and easy to maintain. Union is much larger because we have a lot of features. Like we have a discussion functionality, we have calendaring functionality, we have just feedback. We have a number of things that we do on the platform, and so managing the full code base gets a little complicated after a while, just because there's so much. There are so many models, so many controllers.
How do you separate the contexts of? Because as you're saying, like you have different things. Because they're like they might be completely isolated from one another. Yeah. So do you separate those, like how, just by directory? Do you create any sort of convention on how to access models, how to access, I don't know if you use service objects, like what's that like?
Yeah, so really we don't do a lot of explicit separation. There is one thing that we obviously separate, which is the management side of Union. And so let's say that you have an account, you run your accelerator program, you have access to both sides of Union. The side where everybody interacts, if you're a member of a startup that is in your program, you can see discussions, participate, look at a calendar, sign up for a specific event, all these things. But as the person who runs a program, you also get access to the management side of that. right? And so those two areas are so distinct that we obviously separate those. They live in a separate namespace, different directories. But for the majority of other things, they live in the same space. One thing that we do try to be careful about is joining things like for example, models that are very similar. So we have a calendaring functionality, and you can run various types of events. You can run office hours, you can run classes, you can run workshops, right? All those things are represented by their own models. We keep those obviously together in their own directory, and all that logic. We try that it's contained in that one folder. But in terms of, do we have very specific separation for a number of these things? No, it's just two main areas: the user side of the platform, the admin side of the platform. Those are very separated, and then we just try to be careful about the naming of models and controllers specifically, to keep things manageable.
Do you see that? So, as we've talked about, I've also been in the Ruby community for a while, but now I'm doing a lot more Elixir as well. And I was familiar, but I got more introduced with the concept of repos, and so a different way of accessing data other than what Active Record does. And coming back to Active Record, sometimes I feel a little bit of pain, and sometimes it's helpful, but in the fact that the way you access data and the data itself, it's all co-located in one class. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Is that an issue that you see working with Active Record a lot? I'm assuming having a lot of modules as your modules.
Yeah. Models, yeah. So it is a problem. I do prefer the way that Elixir and Phoenix organize things, separating the connection to the actual repository of information from the logic of the model makes sense to me. Ruby on Rails doesn't do that too much. And so what you find yourself is sometimes with a large model that does a lot of things, right? It connects to the database. Maybe there's specific queries there that are very specific. And so they live in that model file. And then you have the logic of the application itself, right? And they all live in the same model, right? That's not great, in my opinion, especially when you start to do things that access multiple databases. Then it becomes just really complicated. We don't do any multiple database stuff with Union specifically, but let's say that you want to store some transient data in Redis, right? Or some, just memory store somewhere. It doesn't really matter what it is. Having to put those things into the same model file with Ruby on Rails feels kind of too much. And there's no specific mechanism to separate those concerns like you have with Phoenix, or Ecto, or whatever you use.
Right? And did you consider at any point either moving to, I don't know, Elixir is just the example I'm giving, but any other framework? Was that a consideration that you had at some point?
Yes. Moving Union, specifically Union, is complicated. It's a large application, as I said. It would be a tremendous effort to move the whole thing
any rewrite
to some other framework.
But
any rewrite is complicated.
If you were to start either a new project within Union or a new project just by itself, would you consider other frameworks? And yes, and if yes, why? What would be the reasons?
I personally, right now, I would like to explore Phoenix for, I never delivered a production application on Phoenix or Elixir, right? And I really like Elixir as a language. It feels very similar to Ruby. Obviously, it's, some of the same people are involved, or people who have been in the Ruby world before. And so it feels similar, but there's some nuance there. And even in the design than Phoenix as a framework, right? Some of the things I like better in Phoenix now, it feels very 2020, which, as compared to Rails, which I don't know. But Rails has been evolving. But yes, if I was to start something new right now, maybe
Yeah,
I would
quick
do
question on that. So one
Phoenix.
thing that Phoenix is famous for, and the thing that it started as, is the channels. So Phoenix channels, the way it handles the persistent communication with the client, either
Yep.
through long polling or WebSockets. But
Yep.
is that has been translated somewhat to Rails with Action Cable. Have you
Yep.
used Action Cable and with success? Because I've never actually used Action Cable in production. I don't know like how good it
Yeah.
is.
Action Cable, we use Action Cable at Union in limited fashion, but we do use it. We have cables so we have, as you might imagine, an activity feed for things that happen in your particular community, and so we push things via Active Cable to the user, right, to that feed. And it's fine. There's some performance issues, especially with a lot of connections, which we don't necessarily struggle with, but I've obviously looked at benchmarks, and whenever you compare Action Cable to the channel performance that you get, out of the Erlang,
Right.
it's
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 yeah.
just it's just a different ball game
Obvious.
altogether. But it's fine. Action Cable is totally fine.
Have you looked at, so I'm now all back into Rails world, and have seen some developments in this framework called Stimulus, right? And then there's
Yeah.
Stimulus, forget the name, something. But there's some work on having Stimulus work with Action Cable to be sort of like a Rails version of Live View. And I'm also under the impression that the DHH, as part of the development of Hey, their new product, they were coming out with more stuff about it for RailsConf. That just happened. They ended up not having Hey
Yeah.
ready in time, so he didn't talk about it. But um, are you guys using any of that? And no, not interesting. Yeah, someone saying on chat,
We're
stimulus reflex.
we're
Yes, that's it.
we're not so I haven't explored stimulus reflex at all. I've looked at stimulus when it was first announced, and it felt a little bit more like this is our own take on this, and we're just building it because it's not in the framework yet, and so it felt just very duplicative of some of the things that were already out there. I haven't really explored what they've been doing more
Do,
recently, so maybe that's something to look into. But
do you think that, so you've been in Rails for so long, do you think that it's
yeah.
more and more going towards, it's always been a little bit, but more going towards what Basecamp uses as a default? And should it, this is a long discussion that's been happening for a long time in the Rails community,
Yeah.
but do you believe
Yeah.
this is true? And if even if it is, do you think it's a bad thing for Rails?
So I think it's true to an extent. Um, some of the key things that you see happening in Rails, from the inception of the framework to some of the key functionality that has come up after that 1.0. Even things that are recent, like the revamp of email ingestion. I can't remember what the thing is called, but a lot of it stems from this is something that we needed for Basecamp, and so we're extracting it and adding it to Ruby on Rails. Um, so definitely there's a lot of Basecamp or the building of Basecamp that then feeds into Ruby on Rails. Is that a bad thing? No. I mean, how can it be a bad thing if Basecamp is a successful product that runs in production, that is a monolith, that just runs Ruby on Rails, right? So in a sense, yeah, it comes out of the needs of one specific company, but also it's a very interesting validation. It's a very specific example and very good example of here's the framework, but here's what we're running on it,
Mm-hmm.
right? So I think it's fine that it comes out of Basecamp.
Yeah.
But I don't think everything comes out of Basecamp right now. It's a large core team. It's
Mm-hmm.
not just Basecamp
Yeah.
folks.
It's GitHub and Shopify as well. Um,
Yeah.
Another question, maybe the last, we'll see, but that I have also still in this Rails organization thing that I see a lot coming up in some Rails apps and not in others, which is I mentioned it earlier, the service object layer, service layer, whatever you want to call it. So you're aware. So the concept of do the controllers just always call directly to models, and that's the only layers you have, or there's something there in between. And I'm always interested in knowing people's opinion on that. Like, how do you build your Rails apps?
So right now, so we have direct Rails, direct model access from the controllers. Union is, as I said, a large application, but it's not necessarily a complex application that requires, I'll call it middleware, between the controller and the model. I'm not opposed to it, but I think sometimes we get a little too fancy for our own good. And even though, like, for example, I just said a few minutes ago how I like the clarity of, in the Elixir Phoenix world, separating the repo from the logic, right? I think that's very clear. But in terms of putting an extra layer between the controller and the model, sometimes that's appropriate, obviously, right? But I don't think it needs to happen all of the time, for every application. And so we don't do it. It really comes down to the design of whatever you're building, really.
Cool.
That's it.
No, that makes sense to me. But and another topic that at some point was very contentious in the Rails world, but it's how you do testing, and it's something that has been
Oh
talked
no.
about like forever. But how do you do like testing in terms of the different levels of testing and how much you go into each of those?
Yeah, so testing is as you said it, right, very contentious. I think Pedro was in the chat a while ago. I have the chat open to the side. Pedro is one of our engineers, and he is really passionate about tests. And I usually say that he's our test guy. The so I remember from the very beginning of Rails, right, when DHH promoted just testing everything. And then it became the norm to just do TDD. And then you had BDD emerge. And now we're seeing less and less specification as to how to do tests. And a lot of people are promoting this more minimalist approach to testing in general, right? Which frankly, if I'm honest, is probably where I stand. I honestly think that writing tests before the actual thing makes sense in some cases for the base logic of an application or the base logic of a specific model. But TDD specifically kind of bothers me just because I want productivity. And, some people might say, you can be productive just by knowing that your logic is sound, right? You write the test and then you write the thing and you're productive just by knowing that the tests pass and so you're fine. But I don't know, sometimes I just want to get things done, which I realize it's a very loaded opinion. We run tests in Union. We have a very big test suite on the application, but reality is, and I obviously would never say put an application in production without any tests. But my philosophy really is to limit the scope of testing in general to the areas that feel critical. I can give you an example. So we have, as I said, a very large test suite that goes into, we run UI tests with Capybara. And so we actually test all the JavaScript, all the interactions, clicking every button, opening every modal. I think that's too much sometimes. And there's one thing that we do. I don't think it's a mistake, but it's something that we do that I'd be okay if we didn't do, which is, let's test for the visibility of a specific thing on the screen, like a specific string, right? When you go into that, you have obviously on one side you have a lot of clarity as to what works and what doesn't work in your system. You run the tests, and if they pass, fantastic. Go into production, everything is fine, right? Because you test everything. But at the same time, you change your UI, and then all of a sudden your test suite doesn't pass because you went so deep into testing, the specific placement of a button or the specific existence of a string. And so that I don't necessarily love. I think there's a middle ground here. And so just as with everything, like for example, when you asked me about, some surface layers and things between the controller and the model, just use your own judgment. When it makes sense, do it. If it doesn't, if it's too much, then don't. My philosophy of tests is lives kind of there. I know that they're necessary. I love the knowing that things are running okay, and the safety net that tests provide. But I think that sometimes we go a little too over. We just in general, some people, some philosophies, right, like TDD and BDD. Sometimes we go too deep into those philosophies and just lose track of why they exist in the first place. So
that's good. Fred, again, thanks so much for joining me here.
absolutely,
We're out of time for today. It was a pleasure having you, a pleasure talking to you, and let's keep in
absolutely,
touch.
likewise,
Um,
absolutely. Thank you so much.
okay, bye. Okay, everyone, this was another episode of Subvisual Live Talks. I hope you enjoyed it. Next week, we're back again with a guest that I think is going to be very interesting to talk to, but more on that later. Just follow any of these things here, and you'll get updates on that. Till then, just stay safe, stay home, and see you next week.